someone who is regularly described and in fact was named as one of the 100 most powerful women in the world is somewhat marvellous. And so I ask you all to please let us celebrate the fact that we've got Christiane Amanpour with us tonight. You know, Christiane Amanpour, it has won, I tried to work it out, but I think you've won more prizes than any other journalist.
I don't know.
Yeah, you have. I tried counting and I gave up. And so, you know, you really are in for a treat to have in our company one of the great communicators of our times. She's actually a Brit. She was born in London and has an English mother and an Iranian father, and in fact, as a little girl, went back to Iran with her family and had some of her education there until she was 11. And then she came back to Britain to go to school here, and it was during her time as a student that the revolution took place in Iran, and then her family came and joined, they all settled here in the UK. She was educated in the United States, went to the University of Rhode Island, was already showing signs that she was going to become a great journalist. She did, in fact, got a BA in journalism, summa cum laude. One of those great things that I've always sort of thought about, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, you know. She was hired the same year that she graduated, in 1983. She was hired by CNN, and has had a long and illustrious career with CNN, apart from a sort of slight segue out for a short time to ABC News, but was back with CNN before you knew it. She has covered many of the great and some of the most terrible events in our more recent history. She, of course, has dealt with more wars and conflicts than we can count. She covered the Iran-Iraq War. She covered the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. She covered the First Gulf War and brought a very wise voice to all the coverage that she did. She covered the Bosnian War and the Siege of Sarajevo. I love the fact about Christiane Amanpour in that she challenges that whole idea that sometimes is used to cover, I think, inadequate journalism, the idea of neutrality, where she points out that objectivity does not mean treating all sides equally, because to do so can make you an accomplice in terrible conduct. It means giving each side a hearing, a fair hearing. That you do in the interests of objectivity. But you can't be neutral when you're watching a genocide. And I think that journalists can learn from that. It's the thing that I've always admired so much about Christiane, is how fearless she is, but also that she embodies a sort of moral component in her journalism, high ethical standards which are unimpeachable. She became, from 1992 until 2010, the chief international correspondent. And out of that came a particular program called Amanpour. I actually sort of spent last week in India, and when I would go back to my hotel room, on would come Amanpour, and I would say, oh, there she is, doing it for us all. The Amanpour sort of particular program, in addition to her reportage, gave her the opportunity of doing really important interviews. First person to, I think, interview Tony Blair for international media. You've interviewed Chirac, Musharraf, Hillary Clinton, Rouhani recently. You also, I remember that back in the day, that big interview you did with Gaddafi. You've done King Constantine all the way through to Angelina Jolie, Arafat by phone. That was a bit of a thing, and many other things too. This is one of the greatest journalists of our time. I ask you to say welcome, Christiane.
Did you know you wanted generous introduction?
It wasn't generous enough. Did you know you wanted to be a journalist from being a wee girl?
No, I didn't. I wanted to be a doctor from when I was a wee girl. I thought that was going to be... You know, it's interesting, actually. women, when you ask them, when I travel around, young girls, when I say to them in Afghanistan or Tehran or Saudi Arabia or wherever it is, what do you want to be when you grow up? All the girls say teacher or doctor.
Interesting.
It is interesting. They haven't yet started to say journalist, astrophysicist, you know what I mean? Not journalist, I mean, engineer or whatever. They think those are sometimes the men's arena. But no, I didn't necessarily want to be a journalist. And in fact, what you described up there, the Iranian Revolution, is what made me want to be a journalist. Because, yes, I had been sent by my parents to boarding school here in England at the age of 11 and a half when I got here. But my home was still always in Iran. I would go back every holidays. And it just so happened that after my A-levels, which I did not do well in, I had a very unfortunate encounter with the A-level system. I couldn't go to medical school, and I was really depressed. I was staggered that I hadn't measured up after having got 11 very good O-levels. In those days it was called O-levels, and I did very well, and I had great science teachers, and I really thought I was going to fly through. But I changed my school between O-level and A-level, and what we didn't do, now of course all parents and teachers check out what subjects are strongest in whatever institution they want to go to. Well, of course, 40, 50 years ago, we didn't do that. So I was sent to this A-level sort of school where they didn't teach the sciences properly. In any event, I didn't do well, I failed, and I was in Iran as the revolution started. So exactly 40 years ago, 1978, January 1978 is when it started.
Started off, yeah.
And I was stunned because here was my life being turned upside. Not only had I failed my A-levels and I couldn't go to medical school, but my whole world was being thrown upside down. The political system, the idea. Yes, we were monarchists. What can I tell you? It wasn't a democracy that we grew up in. And for us, the Shah was it. Yeah. And who knew about these Islamic revolutionaries? None of us. Yeah. And so to sit at home and listen to the smuggled tapes of Ayatollah Khomeini, who at the time was in exile in France, in Paris, had the whole world's media at his feet. These tapes were coming in, and we could hear them broadcast from them, or we could hear them as we sat in our garden, and it was really scary, and it was very alarming. And there was martial law on the streets, and I walked outside, and there were these soldiers with automatic rifles and things, and I'm like, this is my homeland. But it made me, because I was already 20 years old, it made me so interested. I was old enough to understand that this was a national and a personal upheaval, and a global upheaval it turned to be, but I was fascinated by it. And that instance of my life made me want to tell those kinds of stories to other people. So that focused me into journalism.
It's so interesting, though, because I, for the first time, went to Iran last year under the cover of going with my husband to a medical conference because I knew I wouldn't get a...
Because you were just a little lady.
Yeah, because I wouldn't have got a visa because of my human rights background. That's and because true. Of my criticisms of the regime. But it was wonderful. I'd always wanted to go because I wanted to visit Persepolis and and Shiraz and everywhere. And it was so interesting to meet with the young and also to see the extent to which there is a romance with that period of the Shah. Because I was one of the people in Britain who was actually feeling rather delighted that the Shah was overthrown because I thought that
you believe Khomeini that he was going to bring democracy and women's rights.
Yeah, can I just tell you something? I didn't figure with that bit of it because there were quite a lot of young. It's a bit like the business in Syria now. There was a cohort of young people who were Democrats. There were people who were wanting an end to monarchy, but they wanted democracy, and they didn't reckon on the religious stuff either. And so there were people who young,
you're right.
Radicals like myself in the late 60s, early 70s saw themselves as being on the side of those people who wanted change.
No, you're absolutely right about it. I mean, as I said, I was mostly I'd been educated abroad, but my cousins, I had girl cousins who were slightly older than me. My father was the youngest of 5 brothers, so all his brothers had older children, so my cousins were much older. Just to say that they were in the streets demonstrating, first against the Shah, which my dad was like, what are you doing?
And then
second, against Khomeini.
And then they got
because
absolutely,
of the hijab.
And
exactly.
then they got beaten up, and they then
so
saw
it's an ongoing project.
And I've become good friends with Shirin Ebadi, and I've got to know her. And she was the woman who won the Nobel Prize, who was a lawyer. And she did so many of those cases. And she, like that, she was a young lawyer in the courts. She then became a judge. And as soon as that revolution took place, they suddenly came in and said, hijab on your head and you're not going to be a judge because we don't have women judges. And she lost her job. She was, she was marginalised. And then ultimately, because of her work in the courts, became completely ostracised and now is having to live in exile. And, that journey was terrible. But you now have been interviewing Rouhani. And so it's a kind of coming full circle. You're of Iranian stock. You've got that piece of your own history. How do you find him?
Well, I find him brave, and I find, given the system is the system, and that you'll never be able to elect anybody outside the system, of the people inside the system, he is the most what the young people there want. He is the most moderate. He is the most vocal and verbal in wanting to give young people, as he says, more freedoms, more personal freedom.
He was educated in Scotland.
Yes, part of it. Yeah. He doesn't speak much English, though. At least
he's got a bit of Glaswegian.
Maybe a little. But he's also very canny. Before he was president, he was the national security advisor to the previous reform president, Khatami, and I also interviewed him. And so he knew the nuclear file down to, the last dot. And so he knows the whole system, the economy, the military, and he came down on the side of reform. And he has been a reformer within that system for the last 20 years. And so he's trying, and he's sort of, Sisyphus constantly pushing that boulder up that hill, trying to be on the side of the people. And they voted for him, as you know, overwhelmingly the first time, and with an even bigger vote the second time, which was a few years ago. And but the system is stacked against itself. It's self-perpetuating on one side and potentially self-defeating on the other side. The idea of a supreme Islamic leader at the top dictating everything and sort of, playing
and running the police and running the stuff which is
so they play one faction off against the other the whole time, which means that nothing ever happens. It is true, and you saw it firsthand, that the Iranian people, first and foremost, the majority, I think it's 2/3 of the population, is somewhere under the age of 21. It's one of those really young demographics. But not just that, unlike many of the Arab countries, which have a fairly self-defeating education system, which is all by rote, there's no critical thinking, and they obviously don't include their women as much as Iran does. The Iranian young people are amongst the most educated in that part of the world, and particularly savvy in tech. And if you go to Silicon Valley and you look at, even Uber, is run by an Iranian American. Yahoo or Facebook, all these big major tech platforms, and a lot of startups have Iranians in key roles, either CEO, COO, chief engineering, officer, all the rest of it. So very technical,
very advanced in relation to science. I mean, if you when I chaired the Human Genetics Commission in the UK for a while, and it was quite amazing the high level of genetic scientific development that was taking place in Iran.
And I think that if the Iranian people could fully have their rights, it would completely rebalance that whole area. I really do believe that. I think that they have so much to offer.
And the problem is that business of the religious right somehow with the rural people is able to maintain it.
It's not even that anymore. Honestly, it's not. If you look at the elections, the vast majority of people vote for the reforms. And it's not just cities versus rural.
So how could it be unearthed?
Well, it has been. But when you are a dictatorship, which they don't like to be called because they have a quasi-managed democracy, you bring out the thugs. You bring out the Revolutionary Guards. You bring out the ununiformed, what they call basij, the volunteers, the martyrs. And they come out with everything from truncheons to rubber bullets to real bullets, to riding on motorcycles and
Mowing people
crashing
down.
people down, the plainclothes, it's very bad. So, at the beginning of this year, for instance, around many cities, interestingly not in Tehran mostly, but around other cities, there were about 2 weeks of rioting about the economy, about, interestingly, the president having done something, unprecedented, and releasing the budget, which showed to the people for the very first time what the Islamic State forced the budget to contain. And by far the heaviest amount of money, the most amount of money, went to the Islamic institutions. The propagation of the revolution, the Revolutionary Guard, the what we call the Basij, the sort of volunteers, the headbusters, all of those people, and not to education, health, and the economy and this and that. So the people saw that and were livid and went out into the streets. But then the system brought in the, head crackers. But right now, over the last few days, if you've been reading the FT, there's an excellent reporter there who's been writing about the women's protest. For the first time in 40 years since the revolution, women are taking off their scarves in protest, standing on whatever they can find, platforms in the street or whatever, boxes and this and that, putting their hijabs on sticks and waving them around in a silent, peaceful protest. And that's unprecedented. But of course they're being hauled off, put into jail for a period of time, and basically disciplined. But it's something that's bubbling.
I want to go back to the earlier stages of your career, because you graduated and very, very successfully in journalism from university, went straight into CNN, which was still young.
Very startup.
And you started in there, the bottom, and you were doing, and you basically they recognised the brilliant woman you are.
No, they didn't, believe me. There wasn't a brilliant woman. I learned a lot at CNN. I mean, it was actually for me and to all the young people in here today who are thinking about starting their careers after you leave university, and to anybody else who might be interested, it was a remarkable time. CNN had just started up about 3 years previous, so on June 1st, 1980, Ted Turner launched CNN. And I was hired in September 1983. And I did not go to graduate school. I didn't get a master's because we all thought CNN would be our graduate school on the job. I don't think anybody believed CNN would last. It was this experiment. It was this maverick, Ted Turner, who literally invented startup before we even knew that word. And he challenged all the major networks. There were only 3 at that time, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And he went out to challenge the format, to challenge their stranglehold on information and on the ability to reach the American people. And he created this 24/7 thing that was called CNN, and that was on cable, it wasn't terrestrial, it wasn't broadcast. And as I say, nobody thought it would succeed. And so we all went there thinking, well, as long as it lasts, we might as well get some practical experience. And so all of us were university graduates, mostly without master's degrees. And there were a few greybeards who were running the place and would sort of tell us what to do. But it was powered on the back of young people who just enjoyed being part of something new, enjoyed staring down the big guys, and enjoyed what became a winning streak. And it was amazing to be part of that. It was really, really incredible. I mean, Ted Turner himself, if any of you have done any reading about Ted Turner, if not, you should go out and do it, because he is the original brilliant entrepreneur. Really phenomenal person. And he was, he won the America's Cup. He
was a bit of a character. I met him.
A real character. He took over his father's business. He took a billboard company and turned it into this amazing sort of, broadcast or rather television platform. He changed the way the world interacts. And to be frank, nothing's been the same since. And then he took it from a national enterprise to a global enterprise. And everything else is a copy. I mean, all, Fox News, Sky News.
BBC World.
BBC World. But BBC itself, it had the World Service and all that kind of stuff. So it was also a trailblazer and great quality. But It's just tinkering around the margins now. CNN brought 24/7. In other words, news and information on demand. And everything else now is just about platforms. But the actual thing was what he created.
So you went in at the beginning of that great new initiative, which was hugely exciting, but it meant that you had to basically be up and running into things that you didn't know necessarily a lot about. And there was a lot of self-teaching on the game, doing it as you were. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, it catapulted you into opportunities that might never have been there.
There would definitely never have been there. Because what we were able to do is start at the bottom and move vertically up through the system. Those of us who were prepared to work hard, who had a dream, who loved the business, and who really were prepared to sacrifice. And so, I spent my first 3 months as a slave on the international desk. And as a cautionary tale, my first boss was a woman who was not a supportive woman. We can talk about that when we get to the women part of this conversation.
Yeah, we will get to the women part of this
conversation. It was unreal. I couldn't believe it. I mean, most of my mentors were men. Yeah. And the people who enabled me and who had faith in me were men. And it was now that I think about it, I was very lucky.
It's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women.
That's true.
She's going to go there if she's not there already.
She's there
already. Well, there you go.
I will no longer speak ill of her because she passed away.
Oh dear.
But I mean, but I wasn't the only victim. So worked hard doing that. Then jumped into a spot that was opened on the writing pool. Never written for anybody in my life. Started, writing sort of what we call the kickers, the little sort of funny things at the end of an hour-long broadcast, then gradually moved up to write the major stories. Then, again, sort of asked the bosses. It was in 1984, we had the election and the conventions in San Francisco for the Democrats, in Dallas for the Republicans, and I said to one of the bosses, if I pay my way out there and go take my holiday to San Francisco, will you give me a credential for the floor at the convention? And the guy said, yeah. So being CNN, which never had enough people, was always cheap, they needed me. So they paid, not only did they pay my trip, but they picked me up, and so I was working. Yeah. So it was great. I loved it. And so I learned on the fly. It was a cheap place, stuck together with Band-Aids and stuff, but we loved it. And we grew as the network grew. And then finally became a reporter in the New York bureau, and then when there was sort of an empty spot overseas, begged to go overseas.
But you were it was the perfect moment because the Iran-Iraq war.
No, it wasn't.
No?
This was in 1990, in fact.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I didn't actually cover the Iran-Iraq war, and I don't know why it's in my CV, and I'm embarrassed. But what I did do...
I wouldn't tell anybody
What
I
did do was I covered the end of the Iran-Iraq war, which was not in the field, which was this...
What was the first big story you did?
The Gulf War.
The Gulf War?
Yeah.
Because that's when I first saw you on the telly. I mean, I first saw you doing that. I was in America and I watched you covering that.
And it was...
Everybody said, you have to watch this girl.
Yeah, it became a global phenomenon, so it was great. That was a nice...
That was the thing that threw you into the kind of world attention. Yeah. But you didn't just... I mean, you did that. You did that first Gulf War. But the area where I remember... I really remember you so well was the business of Bosnia.
Bosnia, yeah.
That was terrible. And we were all, as human rights lawyer, exercised about what was happening. And you were a clear voice exposing what was happening to the Bosnians.
Again, and Judge Murrow is here, and he's done his share of international prosecutions and upholding international humanitarian law. Look, again, I was just a young girl who had come from a big war, a big set-piece war, where you had 500,000 forces gathered in the Saudi desert. Yeah. The Americans had got this unbelievable coalition, a real global coalition of Europeans and Arab countries and Western countries and Asian. Everybody was there to fight off Saddam Hussein in the name of international and global order. Because he had invaded another small country.
And not supposed to do
and we
that.
weren't going to let that stand. Of course, now,
I mean, it happens willy-nilly every other week.
In any event, back to the point. So I get to Bosnia, which was in flames, first Yugoslavia invaded Slovenia, but there were no Serbs there, so they backed out of that pretty quickly. Then they went to Croatia, and that was a terrible, bloody war, and lots of people were killed, and I covered that to an extent. But Bosnia somehow was the one that grabbed the global headlines, because it was so clearly a case of one side attacking another side. It was so clearly a case of ethnic cleansing, which then, under international law, became known as a genocide and enshrined as a genocide that had to be stopped. But what we were seeing on a daily basis, living in Sarajevo, being in those other cities that were under siege, and being with the civilian population who were being attacked. It wasn't another army that was being attacked. It was men, women, and children who were civilians, in order to move them out of locations that then the aggressors thought that they would, hoover up for themselves, ethnically cleanse it, and annex it for themselves. So we were telling that story, and it was 1992. It was at the end of the 20th century, in full Technicolor, with 24/7 ability to broadcast live, all the television stations, the radio stations, the newspapers, and everyone from all over the world. And the British government didn't want to do anything, and the French government didn't want to do anything, and the American government, with a new president, Clinton, didn't want to do anything. And it got worse and worse, and more kids were killed, and more women were killed. And we were telling this story. But
I mean, you were one of the voices that was saying something that also got you attacked.
Yeah.
Because as you were really sort of saying, what's happening to these people is, of such an egregious nature, that they were saying, hey, this is not neutral journalism.
Yeah, because the people who the do-nothing brigade wanted to be safe in their do-nothingness.
Of course.
They didn't want us to say that actually, this is a crime against humanity.
And you're doing nothing.
And you're doing nothing, and actually international law requires you to do something. But what really got people's goat was that it was white Christians attacking European white Muslims.
Yeah.
And that was a problem, because the world sided with the white Christians. And had it been the other way around, there would surely have been an intervention. And so, this was the beginning of this kind of civilian warfare. And so we were just sort of at the beginning of this, and it was the beginning of the time also. Bosnia was the first war in which journalists were deliberately targeted. In all the other wars that I had, when I was still on the desk and was taking in, reporters' scripts from Lebanon or Central America, or the other wars that were going on before I became a correspondent, yes, journalists were killed and wounded, but mostly in the crossfire. Even in Vietnam.
Never been taken out.
Even in World War II, journalists were not deliberately targeted. But in Bosnia, they were. And that was a whole different and new and scary phenomenon. Anyway, so cut to the chase. You're right, I did get attacked for she's siding with the Muslims, is what people would say. And it was worrying for me, because they accused me of having lost my objectivity. And a journalist whose objectivity is questioned, certainly back in the days when it meant something, lost her currency.
Yeah.
And so I was very, very concerned how to get out of this hole, and how to, for my own self, figure out what I was doing. Was I doing something wrong? And how do I right this situation? And again, I'm young, I've never had press attention, I'm doing the best I can, but I have a big platform. CNN is a big global platform. And it was pissing the power structure off, not to mention the other side in this war. So I understood suddenly what you read out there, that objectivity means giving all sides a hearing. But it doesn't mean drawing a false factual or false moral equivalence. It doesn't mean treating all sides equally. You don't treat the aggressor the same as the victim. You don't treat the rapist the same as the person who's been raped. You just don't. And if we didn't learn that in World War II, we certainly, I hope, learned it, and it needed to be said again in the first genocide in Europe since World War II.
It's so interesting, because I remember I was asked at one point.
It's about the truth, Helena.
It's about truth. Yeah.
It's about telling the truth, and sometimes the truth is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And the people who accuse us today of fake news are the people who don't want to hear the truth.
Yeah.
And this is the problem that's happening right now. And even more than the attack we were under as a profession and as individuals during the Bosnia War, we are under such relentless assault right now from not the usual suspects, but from our own democracies and our own leaders.
In the West, I know. Yeah.
I mean, this is more of a threat. The attack on the free press and the attack on our democracy and the principles of our democracy and the principles of our civil societies is more of a threat to us than dictators. And that's what I heard the other day from one of the original founders of Facebook, Chamath Pali Tipi Haya. I'm going to get it wrong, but he was
You're going to have to keep practicing that.
Yeah. He's one of the founders of Facebook, and he's come out very strongly as saying that those who would, have nefarious intent are using social media to rip our fabric apart, our social fabric apart, and pose a greater threat to us than dictators do.
I'm going to come round to some of the things that are confronting us in our politics nowadays, but I wanted just to pick up on a number of things that you've been able to do, because you have, in the course of your journalism, not just covered those great conflicts, and after the Bosnian thing. I mean, you also then did Kosovo, and then you did you've
Rwanda.
You've done Rwanda. Oh, you did those things in Africa, and also covering more recently the business of Iraq and then Syria.
Yep.
I mean, you were one of the people who felt very early on in 2013. You were a voice saying something should be done to come in against Assad.
100%.
Before it got out of control, and then there was the infiltration of all the kind of extremists. But there was a democratic core, a bit like back in Iran.
Yeah.
There was a democratic core who wanted something else, and then it was kind of overlain with the extremist thing, which then made it much more complicated to intervene. But in addition to those things, you've had the opportunity of doing really in-depth interviews with some of the biggest personalities in our political world over the last 25 years. And I just wanted to ask you about them. I mean, who stands out? I mean, obviously there are the great interviews. I mean, I made a reference to the fact that I remember hearing the interview you did with Arafat, where he was in.
He hung up on me. Yeah.
He did hang up on you. There was a siege going on in Ramallah, and he was in this siege, but he did flatter you as well by saying that you were one of the great journalists. He did. So I remember him saying you were a great journalist. What
you
are you
were talking to General Arafat.
But I do remember. I remember that very well. But you also, you've interviewed some of the people at the moments when, they were doing extraordinary things themselves.
Yeah.
Who was most interesting?
I'm going to go in some order. I guess for me, the biggest interview that I ever did that got the most attention was with the first reform president of Iran in 1998. That was Mohammad Khatami.
Yeah. And
at that time, CNN gave it an hour on U.S. and international television. It just doesn't happen anymore. You don't broadcast interviews for that long.
People don't have that attention span.
No, well, it's not even that. It's just the bosses. They do. I think they do.
Yeah.
But the bosses think that people can only, and blah, blah, whatever. But it was his manifesto of reform, and I found that absolutely fascinating. And he said things about the domestic situation, about people, women inside Iran. He even addressed the Israeli-Palestinian situation and was the first Iranian leader, and I think the only one, to accept that the wanton, killing of Israeli civilians was wrong, that Iran was not for that they were for the Palestinians' rights and this and that, but were not for that kind of, at least he wasn't, for that kind of attack, and nor was Iran obviously for the wanton killing of Palestinian civilians. But it was very important, those things that he said that had never been said before. He reached out to Saudi Arabia, and under his watch the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran was healed and put back together. And I say that because now obviously it's not, and it's two big powers facing off against each other in that region right now. So he was very, very interesting, and it had a huge effect that interview. Even in the United States, because after that, Madeleine Albright gave a speech responding. Oh, I know one of the key things he did was apologize for the
Holocaust.
the hostage crisis. Crisis.
You interviewed somebody, I remember, who actually...
Then Rouhani later acknowledged the Holocaust.
Because that was...
And obviously rejected the Holocaust, but obviously Iranians weren't involved in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
But because
there was denial. Ahmadinejad was a lunatic,
that whole thought. So he righted that wrong. But I guess another really phenomenal interview was King Hussein of Jordan, who just was a phenomenal man. And he was such a courageous person, and he had the courage to make peace with Israel and to be able to sell it to his own people and sell it to his neighbors and to speak openly about it. He was one of the first, along with President Sadat of Egypt, to make peace with Israel. And I always find, you see, so I'm just kind of listing the kind of leaders who go against the grain and who are courageous enough to think outside the box and to understand what leadership means. And it's not always safe for them, and it's not always politically the right thing to do. And it certainly wasn't safe for President Khatami. Look what happened to him. You know, the reformers got squashed in the next couple of elections. His own people were assassinated. Then the Green Revolution happened, and him and the other leaders are now silenced. So, you know, being courageous is not always the most prudent and safe thing to do for your own skin and for your own political survival. The same for King Hussein. You know, he came under a lot of criticism by many in the Arab world, by many in his own country for making peace, but he stuck with it. I wish I'd been able to interview Yitzhak Rabin of Israel, because he again did the same thing. He went against the grain and faced down the hardliners in his own country to make peace. With the Palestinians and to try, you know...
that's looking a bit grim just now, that whole business.
Very grim.
I mean, Trump has not exactly made it very easy for us to envisage anything good happening there. But it's also true that we haven't had a Rabin for a while. I mean, we haven't had somebody who's prepared to take that risk on the side of the Israelis. I mean, Netanyahu is certainly not it.
No.
I wanted to ask you about others, because you've also, you interviewed Blair, you've interviewed Clinton, I mean, both Hillary and...
I interviewed President Clinton only after his presidency. I had a rather infamous encounter with him about Bosnia on a satellite link from Sarajevo, where he got really mad at me because I questioned his policy. I mean, we were really right on the verge of Srebrenica. It was about a year before Srebrenica, and the Serbs were mounting their attacks on civilians in these safe areas. And I asked him why he didn't have a policy and why he was ceding the ground to those who did have a policy on the ground and who did actually have an agenda. And I said, you know, I said, all your flip-flops. And there have been no flip-flops, madam. And, you know, and I was scared because the President of the United States just, you know, slapped me around the face, metaphorically speaking, on global television. But actually, it was good for me. You know, so
you did marry one of his. You did marry one of his team, didn't you? So you didn't. Your order wasn't so terrible with them all.
Right.
What about? But you also did Gaddafi. I'd like you just to talk a little bit about the Gaddafi thing.
So I interviewed, so this was during the Arab Spring. So this happened obviously in the beginning of, it was 2011, right? The Arab Spring? Yeah. And because I had been covering that region for such a long time, by the time it came round to this, and these leaders were still in power, you know, 20 years, 30 years on.
Yeah.
When it came to them facing, you know, oblivion, I got to get in and talk to them. And actually those were two of for me, the most memorable encounters recently, because it's one thing talking to leaders on the way up, it's another one talking to them when they're really on the way out. And so I got in to see Mubarak by accident. I had gone to interview the person he had put in charge, who had been his national security chief. His name was Omar Soleimani. And I went to the palace, and it was really like the fin de regime. I mean, there was literally nobody in the presidential palace.
Empty corridors.
Our heels, marble corridors where the sound was all echoing all over the place. And I just asked one of the I can't remember who it was. One of the people who were looking after us, is President Mubarak here? Not expecting them. I mean, he hadn't been seen in public, and they said, yeah. So I said, well, can I see him? And they said, well, let's check. So they came back and they said, yes, you can, but without your camera. So I grabbed my producer, who was holding a still camera, and I grabbed her, and we rushed, following this guy, into a reception room where there was seated the outgoing President Mubarak of Egypt, who had announced to the nation that he was going to step down. But he was hoping for a transition period of several months. And I got in there, and it was extraordinary to see this person who I had last seen with all the trappings of power, with tons of people following him and hanging on his every word and, fulfilling his every order. Him with the President of the United States, with the Prime Minister of Great Britain. I mean, he was a big ally and a big force because he was an ally and he had made peace with Israel, so it was a big deal. Not for his people, obviously, but to see a broken person
diminished,
like that, it's really, you get no joy out of it, because it really is. And especially, I didn't have a camera in his face. My producer was taking pictures, but from the side, which we published. But there is something pathetic about it. There is something deeply human about it in that moment. And I asked him whether he was going to step down, because what he had said was not, and the Americans had basically, Obama had sort of himself. And the rest of that region never forgave Obama for that, Saudis and everybody. That's what...
Because they humiliated him.
Yes, and he humiliated an ally. That's how they saw it. Of course, the Americans saw it as being on the side of the people. But, so Mubarak said to me, yes, I mean, I've had enough. I'm tired. I'm sick and tired, he said, and I'm going to go. But in a few months. And to an extent, he was right. He needed to, to pave the way. And, you saw what happened. I mean, the people wouldn't have it, and he left several days later. And then we had the Muslim Brotherhood, and then they were, ejected from power. And now we have a dictatorship
back again,
even harsher than the Mubarak dictatorship.
Yeah.
And then fast forward a few months, and it was Libya's turn.
That's right.
And again, I'd interviewed Gaddafi several times, and he's an extremely eccentric, odd person. And he would turn up with these aviator sunglasses. I mean, maybe he was sort of ahead of his time. He had this, Praetorian guard of incredible women who would turn up. Beautiful women in these military outfits,
Amazon.
And they were gone. But he turned up in this car at this seaside fish restaurant to meet me and Marie Colvin, our late colleague from the Sunday Times, who would be killed in Syria a few months later. In fact, a year or so, a few months later, but unlike Mubarak, who could absolutely see the writing on the wall and who admitted that it was over for him, Gaddafi was like
deluding himself,
completely delusional, And there's this amazing bit that we run over and over again when I say, well, are you going to step down? Your people are obviously against you. And he threw his head back and roared with laughter, and he said, I can't remember exactly what he said, but the punchline was, no, my people love me. I'm not going anywhere. Well, in vivid Technicolor, we saw how much his people loved him. I mean, it was brutal, the end that he had.
No, it was brutal.
But you see, to see the pinnacle of power and then the depths of failure or defeat are two incredible ends of the spectrum to be on.
Absolutely.
And I've seen it both, and it's staggering, actually. Both ends are staggering.
Talking about delusional.
And actually, it's delusional on both ends.
Talking about delusional, I can hear people laughing in the audience already. Can I ask you about Trump? Have you interviewed President Trump?
No. I have asked, But as you may know, he has decided that CNN is fake news. Which I must say, I will give you my honest feeling about that. On the one hand, we are very aggressively fighting and pushing back and committing very good journalism and breaking a lot of stories and making a lot of news. And we have, it's been very good for our ratings and our business and all the rest of it. On the other hand, and by the way, that goes across the board. The New York Times, all these other mainstream, legitimate, honest-to-goodness, objective journalistic platforms are doing very, very well. Because people can see that we stand between that and the truth and the facts, between disaster and order. And I think people are supporting us, which is good. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people who believe the lies, the Fox News, the right-wing radio, that whole sort of extreme right-wing campaign against us and on behalf of the president. So the truth is that I certainly feel, and I can't speak for all of us, a bit like an abused child. Dad, Mr. President, is beating us over the head with the full force of the Oval Office bludgeon. Every single day. Every day we're getting bloodied, but, as the saying goes, we are still unbowed. And so just a quick aside, and it occurred to me because I interviewed Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks about The Post, this great film by Steven Spielberg that shows one of the great moments in American journalism when the Washington Post, following the New York Times, faced down the Nixon administration
print and be damned
on the Pentagon Papers, which was their attempt to hide the long-known knowledge that the Vietnam War was unwinnable, but we're still going to keep at it because we don't want to be embarrassed and we don't want to lose face.
And so no notice of the fact that, so many thousands of people were being killed in the process.
Hundreds of thousands. I mean, it destroyed American
a generation
America's self-confidence, and they're still playing out the Vietnam War syndrome. But in any event, at this time, to be confronted with one of the great moments in American journalism was great. Suddenly we're all walking around with our chest puffed out a little bit more. And, okay, Mr. Trump, this is who we are. So it's a very uncomfortable time in American history because, and the history of the press, because obviously our mandate is to hold power accountable. And obviously we do so wherever we are, whether it's in the UK, in the USA, in Iraq, Iran, wherever it might be. But you don't expect, the people who claim to be the greatest upholders of the free world, of democracy, of morality, of the Fourth Estate and the First Amendment, which actually protects journalism like in no other country in the world. You don't expect the president of that country to be knocking you around. So it's a problem. It is actually a problem. And the problem is even not us. It's not the way we feel. To hell with that. That's our job. Sometimes we face these issues and we have to go through it. The problem is the number of people who believe the lies and the number of people who believe, whatever it might be. Whatever it might be. And that is to the detriment of the American... I'll go back to the Iraq War. I mean, look... Did we know for sure that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Not for sure. But did we know we had to challenge George W. Bush, Tony Blair? Yes, we had to challenge them. British journalists did challenge Blair. American journalists, by and large, did not challenge George W. Bush because it came after the 9/11 syndrome. Everybody was afraid of being tarnished as a terrorist lover.
Unpatriotic.
Fox News, the rise of the right was phenomenal at that time. And any journalist, whether from CNN or the New York Times or whoever it might be, who dared challenge the premise of a nation rushing to war, the most dramatic thing any leader can do is commit to war and to commit their nation to war. And we are still paying for the backlash from Iraq. It's in our politics, it's in our culture, it's in Syria, it's in refugees, it's in Brexit, it's in Trump. All of that is the blowback from the Iraq War. So you know, it's happened before when the free press is cowed and intimidated, it can lead to disasters. And so I'm very, you know, clear about that. Our job is not to be liked. Our job is not to rub shoulders and have drinks and cocktails with the rich and the powerful. Our job is to tell the truth, to seek the truth, to never sleep until we found the truth and expose the truth. And our job is to hold power accountable. Without that, we're just PR agents. So it's difficult now, but we're going to keep going.
And it's absolutely fundamental to democracy.
Yeah, absolutely fundamental to democracy, yeah.
I want to then speak about the fact that you are the great woman correspondent of our times. Yeah, I mean, we can't think of anybody else.
I have ridden on many, many great women's coattails.
As all of us do in our different professional lives. But here you are, you've got an incredibly powerful voice, and if you travel the world, you're the person that people know. I wanted to ask you about two things. First of all, I want to ask you about what's happening with equal pay, women in journalism, the fact that there's a big discussion just now across our media. I mean, the business in the BBC. I mean,
but it's not just the BBC. The BBC is just public about it, and actually, it's good to have this public airing of this incredibly unfair situation.
And it's true in America as well, and it's true, across the piece, everywhere.
But it's not just journalism.
Of course,
it's
everywhere.
Everywhere in
Oxford colleges.
Yeah, everywhere. And it's not just pay. It's sexual abuse. It's harassment. It's the whole thing. Look, we all know that millennia of culturalization has put men above women in every single respect, and it's going to take a long time to level the playing field, and that is all we're asking. We're not asking to change one patriarchy for a matriarchy. We're simply asking for equality and for balance and for a level playing field. And not just because, as Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, said to me once, not just because it's the moral thing to do, but it's actually the right thing to do in terms of the health of our communities, the GDP of our countries. Everybody knows, and if they don't know, read the stats, that when women are equally represented and, I add, equally remunerated in the workforce, the GDP of a country goes up. A country as developed as the United States would have a 5% higher GDP if women were equally represented in the workforce. India, 27% higher GDP. So it makes a difference. And if it's not just the money, it makes a difference in just the way we go about our daily lives. And this year, or 2017, has been the year of the reckoning. And I hope it continues through 2018. And I think, BBC journalists are brave to have put themselves on the line for their profession. And it's unacceptable that people who do the same work are paid different rates. It's unacceptable. Whether it's men being paid different than other men, and certainly women being paid different from men because they're women.
Did you ever meet Harvey Weinstein? It's the other bit of this.
But obviously I'm not in his business, so I was never intimidated by him.
So was it to interview him about movies?
No, I didn't interview him. I met him at various social events and also in various sort of talk fests. In US. But I will say that I really didn't like him. I found him incredibly crass, he had a very bullying nature to him, even if he wasn't, bullying you. He was an unpleasant vibe I got from him. Definitely.
Me too. Did anybody ever put their hand up your skirt?
And not in the workplace, funnily enough.
Everywhere else. Everywhere else.
But I'm. It's so pervasive, it's so ingrained that even in 2018, the President's Club could be so crass in public.
It's amazing.
Right? So that means they don't get it yet. Yeah. And we, women, are fed up with playing nice. Because we've tried to do the right thing, we've tried to play, we've tried to be good with the boys' club. Sometimes we've even dressed like guys in our power suits.
We've done always. None of it works.
Doesn't work. We have to start kicking down the barn door. Respectfully, not violently, but kicking it down and saying that we're here, that we're going to be counted, and that, frankly, you're all going to be better off. You men are going to be better off. If it's the one thing I want to tell the younger generation, because that's the generation that counts, and they are so savvy, the millennial generation, I believe, men and women in this generation, I believe, are much more in tuned and sensitive and savvy than my generation, because they look at sexuality with no judgment. They look at the workplace with no judgment. They, I don't believe, have been brought up to believe that because they're guys, they have a right to more than their sisters, their cousins, their schoolmates, whatever it is. So I have a lot of hope because of this generation. But the truth of the matter is that the guys will not be okay if this war continues. And they won't be okay in their marriages, they won't be okay in their workplace, they won't be okay in their churches, they won't be okay anywhere. There has to be a coming together, and there has to be a level and fair playing field. You know, it's enough already. I mean, I really believe that the most important place is in elected politics. I mean, I would love to see more and more young women, more and more young men of our generation, you know, don't think politics is a cynical and evil game. Get into the arena. Change the world where it counts. By being elected, by encouraging other people to vote. I mean, one of the things that really depresses me, and it's still happening, that young people still do not come out in the kind of numbers they need to come out. And again, I always quote Christine Lagarde. I don't know why. She's a great woman, and she has all these facts at her fingertips. She has to, being the head of the IMF. But, you know, she has said, and many others say it as well, that our governments favor older people because they are the ones who care enough to come out and vote.
Yeah.
Where it's the younger people who need to have their rights enshrined and who need to be able to have a voice and a say, because otherwise, you know, the world doesn't work for them. And they get cynical and turned off. And then look where we have. We have extremists coming out and voting.
Yeah.
And look where we are today.
All I can say is, when I listen to you, is thank God for Christiane Amanpour. And it's really wonderful that you are there doing the job that you do, speaking truth to power. And it's our great privilege to have had you here tonight.
Thank you.
So,